designees are present. And I thought first it's good to acknowledge that Sankey Mastrup is here for, he is the new executive director of the Fish and Game Commission, but not a stranger to anybody in this room. And he'll be the designee for the Fish and Game President, Commission President Jim Kellogg. And Roger Johnson is here from the Energy Commission, a designee for Energy Commission Chairman Weisenmiller. And I thought I would just very briefly set the context for today's meeting because a lot has happened since the last meeting of this group. And as everybody will recall, the legislation, AB 2376, that set up this Fish and Game strategic vision process envisioned three different levels of governance. The executive committee, which is meeting here, which is sort of the overall, has the overall ministerial function for the process, the Blue Ribbon Commission, and a stakeholder advisory group. And last meeting, we created and appointed the Blue Ribbon stakeholder group, and in a moment we're going to hear from Rick Frank reporting on their first meeting. But since our meeting, when we made appointments, we made the appointments at the last meeting and then agreed that we wanted a scientist to be added. Since that meeting, Steve Hurst resigned, and it's not recommended that we fill his position. And then later on the agenda, because there was a dearth of scientists that wanted on, but they all had differing experiences and expertise, we decided to balance it with two scientists that we're recommending. So that's later on the agenda. And then the stakeholder advisory group, which is the third level that was envisioned by the bill. On this agenda, we have a recommendation for the appointment of that group and how to start it off. So we have launched this in a very good way, and I was not able to attend the Blue Ribbon Commission meeting. I sent a tape, and then lo and behold, I'm laying in bed channel surfing before going to sleep one night, and there is a rerun on the Cal channel of the Blue Ribbon Commission. And my spouse said, I can't believe you're watching this. But it was very interesting and well done, and I felt very good about it. So I just wanted to sort of put everything that has happened thus far in context, and also just on a housekeeping basis say that we do allow for public comment on items, and we're going to try to limit it to a maximum of 3 minutes today. But I wanted to ask before we move into our agenda if any of the other members had any comments that they wish to make. Seeing none, we'll move to item number 2, which is the briefing from the Blue Ribbon Citizen Commission. And Ann Sheehan is the chair, but Rick Frank is here today for her to report on that first meeting. And thank you for coming. I know you have to leave in a matter of minutes, so I just appreciate the fact that you made the time to be here today.
My pleasure, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, members of the Executive Committee. I'm Rick Frank, on the faculty of the UC Davis School of Law, but here in the capacity as a member of the Blue Ribbon Citizen Committee, and thank you for the privilege and opportunity to serve in that capacity. And as the Secretary has mentioned, I am a pale substitute for our chair, Ann Sheehan, who I've learned is serving on about 5 or 6 different government bodies and has an unavoidable scheduling conflict this morning that prevents her from being here. Well, we did have our first meeting last month, specifically on July 21st. Our first and only action item at that meeting was to elect Ann Sheehan as chair of our 5-member group. We received several excellent briefings from Director McCammon and senior members of his management staff, from a senior representative of the Fish and Game Commission, from the Legislative Analyst's Office. We also heard preliminary testimony from some, but not all, of the stakeholders and constituents of the department and the Commission. We look forward to hearing from others at our upcoming meeting who were unable to join us in July. I'm delighted to see that on your agenda today is the addition of some scientific heft and expertise on the Blue Ribbon Commission. A number of the folks who visited with us and testified before us in July suggested that, and I must say that the need for that was equally perceived by all 5 members of the Citizens Commission, and so we're delighted to have that expertise, and it appears from your agenda that we'll benefit from the expertise of scientists with both terrestrial and marine specialization. Our next meeting is scheduled for next week, Thursday, August 18th, here in Sacramento. And we are working with your staff, with Carol, to develop an ambitious series of meetings firmly designed to develop and provide you with timely recommendations this fall to the Executive Committee. In that regard, we look forward very much to receiving input and assistance from the stakeholder advisory group that you'll be appointing today. I firmly believe that their expertise and perspective and viewpoints will be a key factor in the Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission's deliberations. Let me just make 2 final points. First of all, again, speaking for myself, but also the chair and all members of the committee, we advocate the maximum possible public participation and input as we proceed with our advisory deliberations. We support, and I personally support, a robust and inclusive process. The second point is we hope to receive continuous feedback from you, the Executive Committee, as how we can best serve you and assist in the difficult and process that you're undertaking. With that in mind, I'd like to conclude my remarks with a question to see if there's anything in particular that you would like us to focus on as we go forward and proceed with our deliberations. So with that, I will stop talking, and I would be delighted to answer any questions that any of you might have.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments from members of the committee? Mr. McCammon.
Mr. President, if I could, thanks. I do appreciate the solicitation of kind of input, and I did appreciate the first meeting, and was pleased with the various questions that were asked of those testifying, having to do with a whole range of issues facing the department. Questions about our IT capacity, questions about our legal underpinnings, and just the range of financial questions and so forth, that reflects an interest in the great breadth of complications facing the department, and encourage more of that kind of discussion. There was dialogue among the members. There were questions that were asked, and from one who is going to be providing information to that commission, as well as one sitting here on the Executive Committee, I want to encourage that continued dialogue among you, because you seem to bounce off each other really well in developing interests and concerns and potential ways forward, some of which we've already acted on based upon the question and the opportunities that were provided by the Commission. So thank you for that effort.
And did I see another comment? Did you? Oh, okay. Any other comments? I think I would very loosely respond to your question, because I think some things are going to be very clear over time, but we're just looking for the obvious things to try to help us refine all the input, because we have, as you'll see in a moment, 52 people recommended to go into the stakeholder process. And if you can believe it, that meant saying no to 80. And so there's this wide desire to participate, and we really want to honor that. and you can help us both moving time-wise, because we're trying to make this at a relevant time next year for the process. But also, one of the things that's very key is that there, as always in a process like this, there's concerns that everybody will bring with them, their niche concerns, or just come in with the advocacy for the particular agency or affiliation that they have. And we're really looking for people to step back from that, whether it's the scientists that we're adding in a little while, or whether it's the stakeholder group, and try to look at the broader issues. And with the 6 sort of working groups of the stakeholder group that we're suggesting, they hit all the major themes that we need to address in this process. So my obvious statement is just your assistance in the obvious things, being timely, getting people to represent and look at the broader interests, and trying to get down to work on those 6 things, which are really the things that we have to do. And I think you've shown that you're well on the way already, but there's no magic bullet. It's just looking at those things as we go along.
Well, I think that's right. I had the privilege a couple of years ago serving on the Delta Vision Blue Ribbon Task Force, and similar diverse folks came to that process, and lo and behold, we were able to come up with a set of recommendations that were largely embraced and enacted in law by the legislature. So I'm a raging optimist, and like you, I hope that all of us, both on the Blue Ribbon Commission and the Stakeholder Advisory Group, leave our guns at the door and can take that broad view that you suggest.
Which has a whole different meaning in this context. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate you making the time to be here today as well.
My pleasure.
Then we're going to move to item number 3, the addition of scientist or scientists to the Blue Ribbon Citizen Commission. This is an action item, and there are 2 recommended, because basically I think when it got down to it, people thought among the names that were suggested that first people had to have the time, and that sort of winnowed it down a bit. And also we wanted to balance it so it didn't look like it was from one particular point of view or one particular public agency or one particular interest. And that led to David Graber, the chief scientist for the Pacific West region of the National Park Service, and he's also a member of the board of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and Skylie McAfee, who's the executive director of the California Ocean Science Trust. So we seem here to sort of have the mountains and the sea. Sorry, we don't have a scientist for the valleys, but that is a good balance, and I should make it clear that they're participating as professionals and experts in the field, and that we have asked, as a sort of a condition of being considered, that they maintain open-mindedness, bringing the best thinking to the process, have no agendas, but because this is process and based, their participation is based on the science, and we wanted balance. So that's the recommendation to the full committee, and I would ask if there are any questions or comments that members have.
I would move the item.
There's a motion. Second. I know that if people want to comment, they generally move forward, but just in case, is there any public comment on this item? Any further discussion? Then seeing none, we'll move to a vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Then we're going to move to item number 4, which is the designation of members to the Stakeholder Advisory Group. And we have in our packet the list of 52 recommended stakeholders. And basically we took categories that existed in the legislation and sort of levels of participation, and tried to come up with 3 from each category. And as I said earlier, over 130 applications were received, and that 52 of them are recommended. And just for the record, to clarify, people actually had to apply. So there were times after the deadline when some people came and said, how about this person who hadn't applied? And so we thought with over 130 having taken the initiative to apply, we would adhere relatively strictly to that. So it wasn't possible to accommodate everybody that applied, and every effort was made for balance in this. And there's so many ways that you balance. Balance in terms of the 17 different categories we were looking at, balance geographically, balance ethnically and gender-wise to the extent we could. To be honest, this seems to be a male-dominated issue, but we still reached out and tried to look for diversity in that. And we did outreach before the deadline as broad as possible to make sure that people applied. And I think the diversity of this group represents the complexities and the interests that sort of face the Department of Fish and Game and the Fish and Game Commission in dealing with this. And to the extent possible, when there are a large number of people that applied in a particular area or category, we looked for umbrella groups or representatives from them to try to increase the level of participation or involvement. And I think that it is important for people that are appointed out of this process to coordinate with individuals and organizations that are beyond their own but might share similar interests. And we're looking for that. And all groups of this process, whether it's the group, the larger group itself, or any of the subgroups, will be open to the public. So that it's a transparent process and there's an opportunity for participation at every stage. And no one will be excluded. So all comments are welcome. And given the fact that I chair a number of things, as Resources Secretary, our goal is to be hopelessly inclusive, and we are. If any of you attend the Ocean Protection Council meeting on Thursday, you will see how hopelessly inclusive we are. So that's the background, and the list is here. And the other thing I was going to ask is because we could get bogged down if we had to come back to this group every time to fill a vacancy in case there's a vacancy. And I was going to ask also for just the ability as chair to appoint vacancies if they become vacant, and I would just make it clear I would do it really consistent with the goals I just outlined if that happens. And I just expect, since I actually personally called every person that ended up getting appointed to the Blue Ribbon Commission and talked to them about what it meant. We had a resignation within days of the fact that we appointed them, even though I was really clear and the person said yes to me on the telephone. So no matter how we anticipate this, I expect that there'll be a few vacancies as it moves along. So with that, I would put it out to the group. If there are questions or comments about this. Mr. Dooley.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm struck by the balance. It seems to me to be a very inclusive group. I know many of the people on the list, and they come to the table, I think, with a lot of expertise, and so I would expect this group to really help us in this process significantly and represent a broad range of interests that are affected by what we're doing here. So I compliment you and Carol for the hard work and the outreach and making sure we got a good group to choose from.
Thank you. Other comments? Was that you reaching for the microphone?
I'm trying to shut off my phone at the same time. So, yes.
Well, I'll recognize the multitasking director.
Let's see if I can do it now.
You want me to turn it off?
I do want to acknowledge on there in this process a couple of things. One is the willingness of those 130 some odd people to go through the process of filling out the application, which was no simple task. I mean, it was a serious application. And what that shows in terms of their willingness to commit to the long-term interests of the department and the resources that we're responsible for. So I want to acknowledge and thank those people who applied and kind of encourage them to participate even if they didn't get selected onto the stakeholder advisory group. There are other ways of participating. There are people who represent your interests that are on the stakeholder advisory group, and so reaching out and having that conversation internal to that subgroup is, I think, an important part of the process, and it will be the obligation of those who are appointed to make sure that they're open for that conversation. So don't feel like if you were not among the selected that you're excluded from the process. Clearly not, and encouraged to continue your interest. And then secondly, I really appreciate the reflection that this list gives of the breadth of the responsibilities of the department. It's something that people don't recognize or acknowledge very often. People touch the department because they're involved in fishing. They touch the department because they're involved in hunting. They touch the department because they're involved in the regulatory process. But this kind of sorting of our responsibility reflects the real breadth of the department's efforts. And I want to particularly acknowledge Carol's effort in making sure that each of those categories was covered and that we had appropriate stakeholders in each of those areas. So thank you, Carol, for that work. Kind of one last thing, a bit of business. I wanted to acknowledge, and Jerry's here, Jerry Carnow is an employee of the department. He's the only employee on the list who is in the stakeholders group, but clearly, and I just want to put on the record, representing the Wardens Association, not as an employee. We do, and I'll talk later about how we're going to deal with employee input, but I wanted to, so that there was no misunderstanding about that, that we did acknowledge or consciously put one employee on there because it was the only representative for the Fish and Game Wardens Association. They represent themselves. They don't have hired help to put on an organization like this. So I wanted to acknowledge that at this point.
Thank you. Any other comments right now? Let me just add a couple of things. One is that let me just reiterate what we've been saying at every meeting, that this is actually, I think, an opportunity for Fish and Game staff members to be relieved of some of the problems that they have. That I think this whole process is an opportunity and in no way is an attack on the department or the employees of Fish and Game. And I think it's really important to repeat regularly, because the reason this process is here is that in many ways there have been more responsibilities and duties lobbed onto the department than money or people that come with it. And so I think the goal is to assist people in the department and with the daunting tasks that they've been given. And second, I also want to acknowledge Carol Baker, because it was heroic work on this, and Clark Blanchard, who's sitting in the front row, helped her as well. And this, I think that they became aware of very well who all 130 people were as the sort of gives and takes to put people on. So I wanted to make sure they were acknowledged. And I have two cards from people that wish to speak and I believe it's on this item. Correct me if I'm wrong. And the first one is Eric Mills from Action for Animals, and we have up to 3 minutes if you wish to speak to this.
That was just for general comments later.
Okay. And Virginia, were you general comments as well? Okay, perfect. Then we don't have public comment. So is there any suggested action on this?
To fill the vacuum here, I will move the item.
And I'm going to include in it the authority for the chair to
correct.
appoint
That's correct.
vacancies. Motion? Second by Roger. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Carries unanimously. Then we're going to have a briefing from Carol on organizing the stakeholder advisory group and the process to establish subgroups, to encourage the members that we just appointed to review website descriptions to help determine their participation in the working groups, and to select a main spokesperson. So, Carol?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Before I start on my briefing about the stakeholder advisory group in terms of an operational standpoint, I'd really like to thank the staff from the different agencies and the Commission that helped in the stakeholder selection process. It was, I know that the staff have other jobs to do, and it was generous on the part of the agencies. It was generous on the part of the staff who participated in the evaluation process, and for that I want to thank them. Given that we anticipated and got a strong interest in the stakeholder process, we recognized that there was a need to sort of organize this process and try to determine where the best place would be to start the discussions on this visioning process. And because the group was large, it seemed like breaking them up into working groups or subgroups made sense. So we then built our framework from a suggestion from a coalition of several stakeholder groups who said, well, why don't you take all of the issues that are in AB 2376, and there's, I think, 13 or 14 of those points, and put them in various working groups with labels, if you will. And so what we did was, after the presentation of the Commission and the Department to the Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission, it became evident that, there are still some really good documents that are out there that should be added to this process, along with suggestions made by the Legislative Analyst's Office as well as the different presenters. So we expanded the framework to include the themes from these documents. And so what you have is, and I apologize to the folks in the audience, I just couldn't figure out how to shrink this chart down and still be readable, but there is a chart in your packet. And so on the left-hand side are all the themes from the documents that have been discussed. The Department's 7 strategic initiatives, the Fish and Game Commission's strategic plan, AB 2376, the coalition letter to the Blue Ribbon Commission, the Legislative Analyst's Office recommendations on their July 21st report to the Commission, and any presentations that were presented at that point in time. Then all of those themes were then consolidated into common themes, and then those common themes were then what's the right word? Were then consolidated again into working groups. So we have 6 working groups: the Communication, Education, and Outreach Working Group, the Natural Resource Stewardship and Protection Working Group, the Regulatory and Permitting Working Group, the Governance and Mission Working Group, the Science Working Group, and the Sustainable Financing Working Group. And then nested under each of these working groups are issues or themes that should be discussed in more specificity. And I would caveat this chart and the items on the chart as, at least in terms of from the perspective of themes, that this is really a working document. And so as more presentations are made to the various committees, as the stakeholder groups, working groups come together, there will probably be things that are added and subtracted and modified. But I would say that we're still going to try to stay within the context of the 6 working groups in order for the process to, to be manageable. And the Department of Fish and Game has graciously offered up staff to staff each one of these working groups to answer questions. And I think the dialogue between and also the commission, and so the dialogue between the commission and the department and the stakeholders, I think, will be very, very valuable to the process. Prior to the August 19th meeting, we will be contacting the stakeholders, stakeholder members, to identify their preferences on which groups they would like to be working on. And then depending upon what the outcomes are relative to preferences, I'm going to try to balance out the working groups so that we won't have maybe individuals from the 3 individuals from one particular category all end up in one working group unless it makes sense to do so. But we're really looking to have a balanced dialogue in all of the working groups. We're going to do our best to accommodate people's preferences. We may or may not be able to do that, but we will. I will try my best. And then after the meeting on the 19th, we anticipate, or I would encourage and recommend, that the working groups begin working on that week of August 22nd. We're going to be we're finding rooms, and we're going to be noticing the dates and times, and we're doing that in accordance with the Bagley-Keene Open Meetings Act. So we need to do that 10 days in advance. I realize this is a very aggressive schedule, but I would caveat it by saying that if the working groups are making really good progress, then I think it would be my recommendation to the executive committee that we afford more time for the working groups to work through their issues. Right now, per the schedule, I have the final reporting from the Blue Ribbon Commission and the Stakeholder Advisory Group. That final report to be to you folks by the end of the 1st of October. And then I guess like I said, in closing, I would emphasize that, again, this is a working document, and it's a living, I guess it's an organic process. And like I said, we anticipate that things will be modified, but we think that this is a good framework to begin the discussions for this visioning process, and not only for the Stakeholder Advisory Group, but also for the Blue Ribbon Committee, Commission, as well as the Executive Committee. And I would like to thank all of the staff and the agencies and the commission who helped work on this project. And I would specifically like to thank Angela Doland, who actually put this chart together. So, again, I couldn't do it without their help. So, thank you.
Thank you. Questions or comments? Mr. McCammon.
Two things I'd like to add to it, and you'll see on the chart where you show the working groups list, is that we, kind of thinking this through, realized that it was difficult to have a working group for partnerships or working group for enforcement because they were common themes to all of these things. So you'll see on the list that we ended up putting those as thematic issues for each working group to address for their part of that activity, and because fundamental to what we do is the partnerships that the department has and its ability to carry out its obligations through the enforcement process. So those two things seem to be captured in each of the working groups. So everybody will have a shot at that one, I guess, is the one way to say it. The other thing is that
it keeps coming back to guns and shots.
Yeah. It's a hook and bullet crowd, you know. One of the things that comes up in the all themes list here, and that came up specifically that you brought up, Mr. Secretary, in the original discussion, and was a common discussion item from some of the testimony, was the ability to have appropriate input from employees and a mechanism available for employees to participate in this process without actually taking, frankly, the entire department could spend its full time doing this work, you know. So without doing that, enabling them to do continue doing their work, but participate meaningfully in this process. And a mechanism in working with Carol was developed for doing that in the department, and we have developed a website that allows employees, and frankly, every employee has been informed in an email from me that there's a website available to them to address these common themes. So it's not targeted necessarily at the working group, but the theme the employee can address, that will be then directed into the appropriate working group through your staff. So the employees feel free, and it's a blind process. They can do it blind, or they can say who they are, and frankly, it doesn't matter. There's no retribution in this process, and I assure everybody of that. It is simply a mechanism available for employees to have meaningful input into the process. It's a pretty sophisticated little website that is available on our website for internal employees, and those inputs will be then made part of the working group activity. So I wanted to make sure that that was addressed.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Doolin.
Yeah, a couple observations. One, this I think is a terrific starting point. Having been through more dozens of these processes than I care to acknowledge, a couple observations. One, I appreciate John's comments. There's a lot of overlap among these working groups, and I think it's probably more than I acknowledge. And having some mechanism for coordination and rationalization of of what comes out of the working groups on the boundaries where they overlap, I think is going to be an important process to think about as the working groups do their work. I don't have a particular recommendation, but I think it's something you need to think about and consider as we move forward. I guess more broadly, I've always found that the products of these efforts are the most valuable with the more iterative the process is. And so to the extent we can put products out early, get feedback, adjust, and have a lot of interaction in the process, I think you end up at the end of the day with something that people feel is representative of their various levels of input and is probably more useful moving forward. And so again, and we sort of have three stages of this built into the process with the organizational structure. But even for the stakeholder groups, I mean, I think getting some feedback, for products back and forth is a very valuable mechanism to to assure broad buy-in to the end product. So I would, Carol and Mr. Secretary, encourage you to think about, how you manage the products of these groups and rationalize them and seek input as we move forward.
Thank you. I think those are great comments and great suggestions, and I'm going to give Carol a chance whenever we're done with this to make any closing comment. Other comments? Yes, Roger.
I appreciate the opportunity for the staff to have this website to provide their comments on it. Is this also being available to the wider public and maybe to the ex-employees who might have also good information to share on these different themes? And so would there be an opportunity for other people to provide their comments and then feed those into the working groups?
Well, we have on the Vision website, I think it's a contact us, and that would be an opportunity for individuals who are outside of the department to comment. And we don't. It's not as sophisticated as the one that the department has put together, because theirs is on an intranet, so it's obviously a closed system. But we have on our website a place where those individuals can go and make their comments.
Any additional comments? Then let me just say, I think you did a great job, and it will be something that, as we move forward, I'm sure there'll be other questions and issues that we'll attempt to resolve, but it's a great launch in trying to organize everything together. And I have to confess that when I first saw this chart, it sort of gave me palpitations, and then as I've gotten used to it, it makes a lot of sense, and it's very good structure. But do you have any closing comments you'd wish to make that haven't been made in response to any of the questions?
Well, I think all the comments that were made by the members, I've taken copious notes, and they will be very helpful. And I definitely do agree that trying to get some products out there early for comment and review is really a great idea. The way I currently have the schedule for the stakeholder advisory group is that, and once we have the meeting on the 19th, I'll see if they want to proceed on this path. But basically, I have the subgroups meeting at least once a week with a summary Uber meeting on Friday, so that everybody can talk and say what they've been learning in their respective groups, and encouraging them to get beyond the discussion the discussion point and actually trying to work towards some actionable items. So.
Great, thank you. And Sonky, do you have something to say?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. One of the concerns I always have when I look at a project as ambitious as this, and having participated in several like this, one of the first concerns is this is going to require a lot of caretaking of the groups, especially materials coming out in a timely fashion. That's a huge workload, and I just have a concern is, do you have the resources, or I know the department and the commission are helping you a lot. This is from where I sit, this is a frightening workload, and I just want to make sure that we make the resources available so you can properly staff this, whether it's facilitation or producing documents, because of the pace, it's not very forgiving, and so that's something I always have great anxiety, because this could collapse under us.
Well, every day I thank Ms. Baker for coming back to work the next day, and after you have made your comments, I will thank her tomorrow. But noted and appreciated, and yet that's what's going to make it successful, is spending that much time on it. And we've been working really hard on this, and I think we're going to continue to do that and try to devote whatever effort it is to keep a handle on it and move it appropriately. This was just an information item, so no action was required. And that takes us to public comment. And this is where I have the two cards. And so the first one is Eric Mills. Eric?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Members. My name is Eric Mills, Coordinator of Action for Animals in Oakland, California. That's for the folks. I was pleased to hear you speak of diversity. And then I look at this committee, and it's a bunch of old white guys again, with all due respect. I've been coming to Fish and Game Commission meetings for about 20 years now, and I've had some concerns over the years, and I think diversity has been one of the biggest ones. I know Bob Campbell, back in 1988, I think, Assemblyman had an ACA 44 to change the makeup of the Fish and Game Commission, change the members from either perhaps 7 or 9 members to give a broader overview and better representation of the public. In 130 years of the commission, we've had 2 women, and that's all the commissioners have always been either hunters or fishers or both. And as you know, hunters and fishers are disappearing breeds now in this state. And as the ethnic background changes in the state, there's going to be a lot more pressure on wildlife and habitat. So I made up a paper with a few things I've been thinking about. I hope you'll take a good hard look at the Hoover Commission report back in 1990 and the Trainer report from 2 years ago, talking about a lot of these same issues so we don't have to reinvent the wheel again. A lot of good suggestions in there, I think. I, too, would like to see the commission expanded. Also, I think there should be specific requirements, qualifications for commissioners. Right now, it's just a political gift awarded by the governor, and I think these people need to be qualified. Perhaps some consideration might be given to electing these members or being appointed by a neutral board. Politics gets involved a lot. One of the best people we've ever had on the commission, I thought, was Cindy Gustafson. And many of us think that she was forced off the commission for political reasons 2 years ago. And we lost a good person for the wrong reasons. Commissioners, as you know, are all appointed by the governor. And in some states, Nevada is one of them, the commission has the power to hire and fire the director of the department. No offense, Mr. McKemmon, I think you're doing a good job generally. But I think there's a conflict of interest quite often when the governor appoints the director and the commissioners, and the commission's money comes from the department and the information from the department. And then sometimes the commission, as last year, voted 5-0 to stop the importation permits of frogs and turtles, and yet the department went ahead and said we will do this on a month-by-month basis since he works at the pleasure of the governor. That ain't right. And I think we can fix that, and it needs fixing. In that paper I gave you, there's an article in Audubon magazine from last year on how to fund various fish and game departments around the country. I think there's some good information there, because that's going to be key. And I'd hope to be more enforcement folks put on the advisory committees. I'm really happy that Jerry Carnell is on there, but enforcement is a key issue in all of this. If you don't have the people to enforce the laws, they're going to be ignored. What do we have, 190 wardens in the field now? Probably need 1,000. And we're losing a lot at the moment. So I'm glad this is happening, and I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your comments. And the next is Virginia Hanley. And while she's walking up, I'll just say for the record, all the white guys sitting up here are sitting up here by virtue of the statute which set forth who fills these positions. All the rest, you see more diversity because we had choice over it. Virginia.
Hello. Hi, I'm Virginia Hanley with PAWPAC, and I've been attending, as Sonky knows very well, the commission meetings for many, many, many years. And before me, there was Gladys Sargent, was actually before you, Sonky, started attending commission meetings in the 40s when they were held in the back of bars in Reading. And
that was definitely before the Public Meetings Act.
Well, Gladys came to those, and she was the public. But I don't see much has changed. It's basically, I'm sorry to say, a hunting club. The priorities are the same. I would like this committee to also look at the policies, the written policies, which are in here, the Fish and Game Code, which equates bird watching with hound hunting, calls hound hunting a conservation tool, that the purpose of the department and the commission is to promote hunting. There are, 97% of the public that doesn't hunt? There are a lot of us, and we are stakeholders too. We are non-consumptive, not even users necessarily. We appreciate wildlife for their own inherent values, and we just don't see that at all reflected in any of the policies or actions of the department or the commission. For instance, I attended a Wildlife Conservation Board meeting where Mike Flores, who is head of the commission, said, "I'm not interested in any land that doesn't include hunting." That's not right. I mean, he's there, they're all there to represent public interests. So I think to look at their policies and also their mission statement. I attended meetings where we tried to, they were redoing their mission statement and trying to get just something in there that these animals have their own inherent value that is not dependent on whether we use them or not. And I think that needs to be looked at. I had done I had done a report once for Huey Johnson, who was your predecessor, and we're trying to find, well, where can we come together, and that these organizations, the hunting organizations, that they are conservationists, they're environmentalists, and I told them that I don't see it. Unless hunting's involved, they have no interest at all. And I went through all the bills back from into the 90s of the support to oppose and all that, and I just didn't see it. If it was an environmental bill, they had no interest in it at all. If it was hunting, they were for it. If it was just a lot of prejudice there, bias there. At a recent Fish and Game Commission meeting, I was told by Jim Kellogg, who is an avowed hunter, and of their legislative report, and I wanted to speak on the legislative report. He said, he didn't want to hear it. I could not speak. I was not allowed to speak. And he said, "We only take recommendations from the Al Tauscher Committee and the Marine Committee." Well, I remember Al Tauscher, and his only interest was in the consumptive use, the hunting of animals. So things like that are very disturbing. When I asked the commission, "Where's your Aldo Leopold committee? Where's your John Muir committee? You got Al Tauscher. This is what you take your recommendations from." I just don't see any reflection of any environmental concerns or the concerns of the general public, too.
Could you begin to wrap up, please?
Yeah. I think that's it. Wildlife belongs to all the people of California by law, and I think 97% of them are being neglected. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. We appreciate it. Those were the public comments I had cards for. So we'll move to item number 7, which is just Carol describing any follow-up or the schedule for the next few months.
I will be sending out a schedule for. I've been working with your executive assistants on finding times, etc. The next scheduled meeting is I believe, August 24th, and that will be basically a status report from the stakeholder advisory group, although they would just be they'll just be getting started. And then also from the Blue Ribbon Commission, they will be meeting on the 18th. I'm sorry, I didn't bring the schedule with me. But there's at least one other meeting in September, and then the big meetings are October 4th, where the final recommendations from the Blue Ribbon Commission as well as the stakeholder advisory groups will be presented to the executive committee, and then on November 1st, the executive committee is scheduled to adopt and then release the first draft report to the public for comment. And then in the next month or so, I will be working on the next scheduling through February and March of next year.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Mr. Dillon.
Secretary, I talked to Carol about this the other day. Unfortunately, I don't envy her the task of rationalizing our schedules. But I have and will be designating a fill-in because a couple of the upcoming meetings are going to be very difficult for me to participate in. And so his name is Bill Frost, and he is the Director of Cooperative Extension working for me in the university system-wide office. And I think he'll be probably more than an adequate stand-in for me. So he'll probably be attending the next couple of meetings.
Okay, thank you for noting that. And let me just appreciate how aggressive that schedule is, and we'll just do our best because we'll be balancing the content with public participation, and we're trying to do them both. So any final comments? Then thank everybody for their participation today. It was very productive. I think we've really launched the process and look forward to getting to a successful conclusion. The meeting stands adjourned.